The morning it happened, I had just put the kettle on. That is what I keep coming back to. Not the words themselves, not even the silence that followed. Just the kettle, the small, ordinary sound of water beginning to heat in my own kitchen, in the house I had lived in for 31 years, the house where I raised my son, the house where I watched the maple in the backyard go from a sapling I planted with my own 2 hands into something tall enough now to shade the entire yard by noon. My daughter-in-law walked in, looked at me standing at the counter, and said, without pausing, without even lowering her voice, "You're always in here. Can you just go somewhere else for a while? This is our space now." She did not look at me when she said it. She was already turning back toward the hallway. I stood there with my hand on the kettle. I did not say anything. I waited until I heard her footsteps go upstairs. Then I turned the kettle off, picked up my coat from the chair by the door, took my keys from the hook my late husband installed the year we moved in, because I was always losing my keys, and I left. I did not know yet exactly what I was going to do, but I knew that something had shifted, and that I could not pretend it hadn't. Let me start from the beginning, because it did not start that morning. It never does. My name is Margaret. I am 67 years old. I spent 32 years as a registered nurse at a hospital outside of Hamilton, Ontario. And when I retired 4 years ago, I thought the hardest part of my life was behind me. My husband, Gerald, had passed 6 years before that, a heart attack, very sudden, very unfair, and learning to live alone in a house built for 2 had taken everything I had, but I did manage it, slowly. I repainted the bedroom. I learned how to do the taxes myself. I started taking long walks in the morning, something I had never had time for when I was working, and I found that the world looks completely different at 7 in the morning in October, when the leaves are coming down, and you have nowhere to be. The house is mine, fully mine. Gerald and I paid off the mortgage 11 years before he died, and I kept up with the property taxes and the repairs on my pension and a little savings we had put away over the years. It is not a large house. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms, a kitchen with an east-facing window that gets beautiful light in the morning. In the neighborhood I live in, outside Hamilton, houses like mine were selling for close to $800,000 at the time this story takes place. I say that not to brag. I say it because it matters to what comes next. My son called me in February, 2.5 years ago. He and his wife had been living in a rented condo in Mississauga, and they had a daughter, my granddaughter, who was 4 at the time. He said they were having trouble. His wife had left her job the year before to stay home with their daughter, and his income alone was not keeping up with the rent increases. He said the landlord had raised their rent by nearly $400 a month at renewal, which I knew was happening all over the province. He asked if they could stay with me for a few months, just until they found their footing. I want you to understand something about that phone call. My son is my only child. His father is gone. When he called me with that weight in his voice, the kind of weight that a grown man carries when he has to ask his mother for help, and it costs him something to do it, I did not think twice. I said, of course. I said, come home. They moved in on the first Saturday of March. I had cleaned out the 2 spare rooms, bought a toddler bed for my granddaughter, put new towels in the upstairs bathroom. I was happy to have the house full again. I am going to be honest about that, because I think it matters. In the beginning, I was genuinely glad. The first few months were fine. Not perfect. There is no such thing as perfect when 4 people share a house, but fine. My daughter-in-law and I were polite to each other. We worked out a loose system for the kitchen, shared grocery costs some weeks, took turns watching my granddaughter when the other needed time. My son seemed relieved. He worked long hours in logistics, left early, came home tired, and I think having me there to help with his daughter took some pressure off. But somewhere around the 5th month, things began to shift. It was subtle at first, the way these things always are. My daughter-in-law started referring to the house differently. Not your house, or even our place. Just home, the way you talk about a place that belongs to you. She rearranged the living room without asking me. She threw out some things in the kitchen cupboards. Spices I had had for years. A ceramic mixing bowl that had been my mother's because, she said, she was making room. When I mentioned the bowl, she looked genuinely surprised, as though it had not occurred to her that anything in the house might have a history that predated her arrival. I told myself it was a matter of adjustment. People settle in, they start to feel comfortable. I had wanted them to feel at home. Maybe I had been too accommodating too early, and now the lines had blurred, but the lines kept moving. By the end of the first year, my daughter-in-law had taken over the main bathroom upstairs and moved my toiletries to the smaller one off the hallway without saying anything to me. She had a habit of turning off the lights in whatever room I was sitting in when she passed by, saying she was trying to keep the hydro bill down, though I was the one who paid the hydro bill. She began answering the door when visitors came. A small thing, but one that made me feel strangely like a guest. When my neighbor came by with tomatoes from her garden, my daughter-in-law thanked her and took them and closed the door before I had even stood up from my chair. I spoke to my son about it, once and then twice. The first time, he listened carefully and said he would talk to her. The second time, he looked tired and said, "Mum, she's going through a lot. She hasn't worked in 2 years. She's stuck in the house all day. Try to give her some space." I remember sitting with that for a long time after he left the room. She was stuck in my house, and the solution was for me to give her more of it. I kept the peace. That is what I had always done. 32 years in a hospital teaches you that most situations are managed better with patience than with confrontation. I believed that. I still believe it, actually, but there is a difference between patience and erasure, and I had stopped being able to tell where one ended and the other began. The conversation at the kitchen counter was not the first time my daughter-in-law had said something that cut. But it was the first time she said it without any pretense of softening it, without lowering her voice, without even waiting to see if I would react. There was a casualness to it that told me she had stopped considering my feelings entirely. Not out of malice, I think, out of something worse. Habit. Our space now. I drove to my friend Patricia's house. Patricia is 71, a retired school principal, and she has known me since my son was in grade 4. I sat at her kitchen table and told her everything while she made tea, the real kind, in a pot, the way she always does. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Margaret, what do you actually want to happen?" I thought about it. "I want my home back," I said. She nodded. "Then let's figure out how to do that properly." Patricia's son-in-law is a paralegal who works in landlord-tenant matters. She called him that evening. He called me the next morning. What I learned in that phone call surprised me, and I want to share it because I think many people in my situation do not know it. In Ontario, even when a family member is living in your home without paying rent, there are legal considerations around how you ask them to leave. It is not as simple as telling someone to go. If they have been living there long enough, if they receive mail there, if it is clearly their primary residence, the law provides certain protections. You do not just change the locks on a Tuesday afternoon and put their things on the porch. That can create legal complications for you, the homeowner. But there is a process, a proper, quiet, legal process. The paralegal explained my options clearly. Because my son and daughter-in-law were not paying rent, not formally, not consistently, and because the arrangement had been understood from the beginning as temporary, the situation was somewhat different than a standard tenancy. What he recommended was a written notice, delivered formally, giving them a defined period to find alternative housing. In our case, he felt 60 days was appropriate and defensible. He would draft it. It would be delivered properly. I asked him how much this would cost. He told me his fee. It was not small, but it was not impossible either. I thought about the hydro bills I had been paying for 2.5 years, the groceries, the wear on my home. I said yes. I went to stay with Patricia for 2 weeks while things were set in motion. My son called me the day after I left. He asked where I was. I told him I was visiting a friend and that I needed a few days. He said, "Mum, she didn't mean it like that. You know how she is." I did know how she was. That was exactly the problem. My daughter-in-law texted me once, briefly, to say she hoped I was well. I did not respond right away. I was not ready. The notice was delivered on a Wednesday morning by the paralegal, in person, 60 days. Clear, legal, specific. My son called me that same afternoon. His voice was different this time. The tiredness was still there, but underneath it something else. He said, "I didn't know it had gotten this bad. I told him it had. I told him gently, because I love him, because none of this had changed that, but I told him clearly. I said, 'You knew. I told you twice. I think you chose not to see it because seeing it meant having a harder conversation than you wanted to have.'" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Mum." I believe he meant it. They found an apartment in Burlington within the 60 days. A 2-bedroom ground floor, closer to my son's work. I do not know what the rent is, but I know they were able to manage it. My daughter-in-law's sister agreed to take my granddaughter 2 mornings a week so that my daughter-in-law could go back to work part-time. There were options available to them. There had always been options available to them. Some of those options had simply been easier to ignore when mine was the home they were standing in. The day they moved out, I did not stand at the door and watch them go. I had gone to Patricia's again, not out of cowardice, but because I knew that watching the truck in the driveway would not serve any of us well. My son texted me when they were done. He said the key was through the mail slot. He said he was sorry again. I said I loved him. Both of those things were true at the same time. I drove home in the late afternoon, when the light in October comes in low and gold the way it does in Ontario, the kind of light that makes everything look like it is being seen for the last time and the first time simultaneously. I unlocked my front door. I walked through the hallway. I stood in my kitchen. The bowl was gone, of course. I had known it would be. That particular grief was something I had already made my peace with. I put the kettle on. I want to tell you something I have been thinking about since all of this happened. Something that I believe is the most honest thing I can offer. I made mistakes in this situation. I want to say that plainly, because I think the most useful thing a story like mine can do is not just make you feel righteous anger at the people who behaved badly, but also help you recognize the places where you might be doing what I did. I did not set clear expectations from the beginning. When my son and daughter-in-law moved in, I should have sat down with them calmly, kindly, but clearly, and said, "Here is what this arrangement looks like. Here is how we share costs. Here is the timeline we are working toward together." I did none of that because it felt cold, because they were family, because I did not want the relief of their arrival to be immediately followed by a conversation about rules. But by not having that conversation, I left the boundaries undefined. And when boundaries are undefined, some people will fill that space, not out of malice, but because it is human nature to expand into available room. I allowed small things to pass without comment, because each one, on its own, seemed too small to be worth the friction. But small things accumulate, 2.5 years of small things had turned into a situation where my daughter-in-law felt comfortable telling me I was in the way in my own kitchen. That did not happen overnight. And it did not happen only because of who she is. It happened because I never named it while it was still nameable. I tell you this not to take blame that is not mine. What she said to me that morning was unkind. The way she had been treating me for more than a year was not acceptable. Those things are true, but I could have interrupted the pattern much earlier, and I did not. And I think if you are in a situation like mine, or if you are approaching one, the most important thing I can say to you is, have the conversation you are avoiding. Have it while it is still a small conversation. Have it before it becomes the only conversation left. My son and I have dinner together now, the first Sunday of every month. Just the two of us sometimes, or with my granddaughter when it works out. The relationship with my daughter-in-law is still finding its footing. She has not apologized directly. I do not know if she will. I have decided that I cannot make that my condition for moving forward. I can hold what happened honestly in my memory without letting it be the only thing that defines our relationship from here. That is still in progress. I will not pretend otherwise. But I want to tell you what it felt like the first morning I woke up in my house alone again. I made coffee in the French press. Gerald gave me the Christmas before he died, the one that had been pushed to the back of the cupboard for 2.5 years because my daughter-in-law preferred the drip machine. I sat at the kitchen table by the east-facing window. The light came in the way it always had. The maple in the backyard had gone fully golden by then, that deep October yellow that never quite looks real. I wrapped my hands around the mug, and I sat there for a very long time. Not because I was sad, not because I was triumphant either, just because I was home. There is something they do not tell you about getting older, or maybe something that gets easier to forget when life gets crowded and loud. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to say, "This is mine, and I choose what happens here." You are allowed to ask for help and still maintain your own dignity. You are allowed to love someone completely and still require that they treat you with respect. Those things do not contradict each other. I spent so many years in a hospital watching people at the hardest moments of their lives, and I can tell you that the regrets I heard most often were not about the confrontations people had, but about the ones they didn't. The conversations they kept putting off. The things they let slide because it never felt like exactly the right moment. There is no right moment. There is only the moment you decide that your peace matters enough to protect it. The kettle is on. The light is coming through the window. The maple is doing what it always does. I am not starting over. I am just continuing from here. And that, I have come to understand, is exactly enough.